Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it is always hard to come back after lunch, but I am glad that you all are here because I am very excited about this panel, and I think that you should be too. Because I have 5 strategists on stage with me who are going to explain how managers should be thinking about strategy in this era of ecosystems. So we're going to build on what you heard this morning. We're going to try to build on what was discussed this morning, and hopefully we're going to set you up for the rest of the conference with a useful and actionable understanding of what ecosystems are, how they're useful, and how to develop and manage them. Before I quickly introduce the speakers, I just want to give a brief rundown of how we're going to use this time. So we are going to hear everyone speak for about 5 to 6 minutes. They'll be up here on the podium. These will be fairly short presentations, and then I'm going to moderate a conversation with all of the panelists together. And then we'll make sure to have at least 15 minutes or so to open the floor to questions. We're not using Slido, so there will be mic runners, so just raise your hand, and I'll try to call on you if you want to come to the front or find someone with a mic. But start thinking of your questions. We want this to be useful for you, and we'll make sure we have time to do that. Now, I am thrilled to quickly introduce our speakers. You have their full bios in your programs, so that is where you will find their long list of accomplishments. But for now, to my left, I have Martin Reeves, chairman of the BCG Henderson Institute, Rafael Ramirez, a professor at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford, Helmut Reisinger, the CEO of Orange Business Services. Then to his left, Yoshikune Takashige, the chief strategist of global marketing at Fujitsu Limited. And finally, we have Valerie Hackl, the managing director of Austro Control. So thank you all so much for being here. And now I'm going to ask Martin to kick us off by explaining how he thinks about what a business ecosystem is, when you need one, and how to develop it. Martin, thank you.
Thank you. So the central question for this group is essentially, does ecosystems change strategy? And I want to make a case for the fact that it does change how we think about strategy by looking at 3 simple questions and then synthesizing. So the first one is, what is an ecosystem? Now, as we heard this morning, an ecosystem is a metaphor for anything collaborative. And so we can, of course, take it to mean anything we want to. I think a useful way of defining what is new about ecosystems, and by the way, I think there is a new phenomenon. 10 years ago, none of the world's top 10 companies by market cap were platform-based businesses. Now 7 are, so there's definitely something going on. And what is going on? I think we can think of 3 traditional forms of governance: a vertically integrated company, a static supply chain, and an open market. And to me, ecosystems have a unique property, which is they are intermediate in terms of flexibility and in terms of coordination between static structures and the open market structure. So an ecosystem is I think I would usually define it as a flexible arrangement where a group of companies provides a coordinated offering. So it has some of the flexibility of the open market and some of the coordination of the traditional company or supply chain. So that means, if you agree with my logic, there is a new choice here. There is a new governance structure that we can choose. When would we need an ecosystem? Well, it may seem from this morning's discussion that an ecosystem is a panacea. I think it isn't. A couple of things have to be true in order that an ecosystem, as I defined it, not as a general metaphor, but as a specific governance structure, is the appropriate one. One thing we need is modularity. We need the ability to split the offering into components that can be offered or provided by different players, but we also have a need for coordination. We need an orchestrator or a platform to be able to coordinate those components. So in those situations, it's a very useful form. In other situations, where users are perfectly happy to assemble a simple offering for themselves from different components in an open marketplace, it's not the right form. So I think on this question, I would say we have a new contingent choice. We have a set of circumstances where ecosystems are useful and a set of circumstances where ecosystems are not useful. And that's a new way of thinking about strategy. There's the question, how can we design an ecosystem? So we recently did a piece of analysis where we looked at 100 ecosystems going back in time so that we could pick up the ones that never took off or the ones that did take off and failed. And what we found was that essentially only 15% of ecosystems over a 10-year period actually thrived sustainably, and 85% failed. And all of the successful ones basically navigated 3 inflection points: the inflection point of gaining critical market share in the first place, the inflection point of seeing off imitative offerings, and the inflection point of occupying some choke point and locking in leadership. And so I think the interesting thing about this perspective is it says that we can't entirely design an ecosystem in the sense of one design forever. We can guide the development of an ecosystem, but it's essentially a co-evolutionary process. And the successful ecosystems are in constant motion, constant evolution. So again, that's rather different from designing a static company architecture that is good for a decade. In the interest of time, I can't go into some other questions, but I think even from these 3 questions, we can say, well, there's something new here about strategizing. There's something about new choices that we probably visit on the panel, ecosystem or not, nested ecosystem, open ecosystem. We have different types of design choices, and those are new choices. I think the new choices require new thinking. There's something about thinking about the unit of analysis as being the firm and the ecosystem, not the firm. There's something about multilateralism. It's not my strategy, it's the strategy of my company and its partners. There's something about emergence, the fact that we can't entirely design and foresee all outcomes, so we're shaping rather than controlling, and so on. And then I think, interestingly for practitioners, there are new questions that we don't have a textbook for. And I'd say this is an exciting area of strategy where practice is racing ahead of theory. So actually, hearing from some of the practitioners on today's panel will be very interesting on questions like, we begin to know what an orchestrator strategy looks like, but if you can't be the orchestrator, and the vast majority of firms cannot be orchestrators as their ecosystem, what does a successful complementer strategy look like? There are questions like, how will ecosystems eventually be regulated? And what should be the regulatory strategy of people designing and employing ecosystem strategy? There's the question of platforms requiring, in general, huge upfront investment, and always a question from investors, will this investment ever pay off? Will Uber ever make money? These sorts of questions. So we need new health indicators. How would we know? What indicators would we look at as predictors of eventual viability? So I think, in conclusion, I think it's not old wine in new bottles. I think it's new wine in new bottles from the perspective of strategy making.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Hello. So just as you're sitting down and before we move on, I really like the visual you had of when you need an ecosystem, but I'm wondering if you can give us an example of a situation where an ecosystem is absolutely necessary and an example of when one does not actually make sense.
Well, if you're trying to create, let's say, a competitive app store for a phone and you don't have any apps, or you want to move very, very quickly, you're borrowing the capabilities of others, you're establishing standards so that the apps all work on the same platform, so you need the coordination, you have the modularity, and you have the business need to borrow other people's capabilities to move fast in a collaborative fashion. So that would be a case where it's hard to imagine a non-ecosystem solving that problem.
So Apple's App Store.
For example. On the other hand, if you're a chocolate manufacturer, we don't have digital chocolate yet, as far as I can tell. It's a scale business with high brand loyalty. It's all about category expansion and economies of scale. I mean, an ecosystem would make no sense for for a major chocolate manufacturer, for example. So we're not talking about a panacea here. We're talking about a new tool that's relevant in particular circumstances.
Specific situations. Thank you. Very interesting. So next, we're going to hear from Rafael, whose presentation I think is a really nice follow-up, especially to the last slide of Martin's on how strategy thinking must change in order to understand ecosystems.
Good afternoon. I'm here because Richard Strauss's daughter had the good idea of giving him this book last year for Christmas. So if you're looking for a Christmas present, and so that's how he found out about me. This book is the result of 26 years of work. The first time I published my work was 26 years ago in the Harvard Business Review. This was before ecosystems were well known, and we called it value constellations. And one of the key cases in the book, there were three. There was Danish pharmacists, French water companies, and IKEA. IKEA is a very interesting early move of the ecosystems. And one thing that makes IKEA work very well is that they have a very clear view about what they do for you and what you do for yourself. So as opposed to a Michael Porter value chain, where the customer is at the end of the chain and basically is assumed to destroy value, IKEA assumed that clients are there to create value. And that value co-production is at the core of ecosystems as we understand them. So I delved into this and found that IKEA is still, this is from a couple of weeks ago from their websites, they're very clear that they continue this co-production mode, co-production to make social differences, co-production to make the furniture much more sustainable and environment friendly. I delved into the value co-production literature and published this article in 1999, so still in the previous century. I am that old. And the concepts are actually about 350 years old. And one of the questions is, why is it that a 350-year-old tradition has taken such a long time to become mainstream? And the insight is that it's not, as Michael Porter would say, about shared value. It's about orchestrating a multiplicity of different values that are, on the face of it, very incompatible with each other. So the methodology in the book is about looking not at the stakeholders that you bring together in terms of power and roles. Our analysis, my colleague Ulf Mannervik and mine, is that you do not design ecosystems. You design core offerings. And one of the cases in the book is a company that no longer exists called MySpace. MySpace was ahead of Facebook and sold itself to the Murdoch empire. Actually, Murdoch later said that they misunderstood what they had bought and did not realize what they were doing with it. They tried to monetize the ecosystem too early. Facebook did what it does still very well today. It concentrated on redesigning on and on and on the core offering, which was to get people to communicate with each other better. And so our insight is that there are three elements to make these what are now called ecosystems, and we then called value constellations. First of all, you have to attend to the multiple values. And I'm currently working very much on the ecological values involved. All of this digital stuff is now producing more CO2 emissions than the airline industry. So how is the Internet of Things or 5G going to be sustainable? Secondly, we look at design as a profession and very much designing the offering that is the core relationship. And all of the other offerings are different. So instead of looking at the blobs in a ecosystem, we look at the connections between the blobs. And the core connection is an offering, like an employment offering or an investor offering. And there's a whole design behind that. there's a bunch of cases in the book, Scania Trucks, Facebook, the World Economic Forum, Davos, how it was designed, GE Healthcare as it was at the time of the book. And the kind of ecosystem we look at, and this is my last slide, is an example from Électricité de France coming together with the World Bank, with the Thai government and the Laos government, and creating a value-creating system where the trick here is that there are multiple values which are depicted by the arrows. And those values have to be put together so that the difference makes music rather than noise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafael. So,
this is a gift. This is a gift for you.
thank you. It's not even Christmas yet. So, but before we move on, can you just walk us really quickly through one of the examples on your second to last slide of those cases of what makes a successful offering? Because I'm trying to understand the key components or the key architecture that makes an offering like Facebook successful.
So the idea is that there is value generated by the parties that the offering puts together. If we look at the moment in the recent news, the Saudi Aramco offering in the market where somebody had to go and tell the chairman, you're not worth 2 trillion, you were worth only 1.6. That meant that what they thought was valuable to the kingdom and what investors thought was valuable to them was mismatched. Mm-hmm. So when you get a job offering, or you put out an investment offering, or you make a commercial offering, there has to be value on both sides. And we went back to the anthropology of the gift. When you give a gift to somebody, you offer a gift to somebody, it's very bad manner not to receive it. Mm-hmm. And when you receive it, you in fact are entering into a relationship of having to give something back at some point down the road. So the gift economy, where you offer gifts, precedes the monetary economy. Mm-hmm. And the monetization of that just makes the gift economy, the offering economy, a bit more liquid.
So it has to be symbiotic.
But there's mutual obligations involved, there's work sharing involved, there's risk sharing involved, and the question is, does it make sense the right way? The way MySpace went about it was to try to build the ecosystem without the core offering being understood by both sides, and people just left it in droves and went to Facebook.
Helpful, thank you. So now we're going to hear from Helmut about how why Orange, a major telecom and IT player, why they care about ecosystems and how they've adapted their strategy to transform into one.
Good afternoon. I'm not coming with a book. I wanted to tell you what we believe has changed at Orange Business Services in terms of the ecosystem importance. Ecosystems have been there quite for hundreds of years, ever since Adam Smith started with the concept of the invisible hand and market economy started. Yet, things have changed. What has changed really on ecosystems, and for us particularly as a global digital service provider in the B2B space, is first, the ecosystems have become global. They are no more confined to a country or to a continent. Second, they are much easier to build. And third, the knowledge about it is much more spread, and you can evolve in a much more agile way in an ecosystem. What is the reason for that? You see it, and I want to share it in 3 pictures. You see here the first one, which is our concept of what we call the Internet of Enterprise. The abundance of data has changed profoundly the way how ecosystems are being able to be managed. It started off in the 80s, and we had Vint Cerf here, the founder of the Internet, and in the early 90s, we were happy to be connected. Oh, the 64K modem tone, this was fantastic, and we were on the Internet. The second wave is where we are living now. The abundance of data has exploded. It's what I call the consumer Internet. It's connecting people, it's sharing emotions, and today, it's you and me as individuals across the world who are sharing and creating most of the data on this planet. The third wave, and in 2025, it's going to be the enterprises that will create most of the data on this planet. This is the Internet of Enterprises. and we want to be a leader in that. And we've said 2 years ago, this is an ecosystem play. The consumer internet is a mobile play. The B2B Internet of Enterprise is an ecosystem play. Now, what has changed again as well on the ecosystems is that, and I think you mentioned before Michael Porter, every company has a certain value chain. There is something being designed, created, it's something being produced, there's a supply chain around it, there's something being sold, there's an after sales. What has changed were 2 fundamental topics. Now it has become global, and over the past 3 decades, more and more parts of this value chain have been actually mirrored in digital ways. And this is why it's so much easier nowadays to really establish ecosystems, to share about ecosystems, and to make them evolving. And you see the data value chain is starting from collecting data, transporting data around our networks, to store and compute, which is hyper important if you are in a little village in Brazil and you need to have the same ability, as Peter F. Drucker would say, for your knowledge workers that are cooperating on a global basis now. Then, of course, we talk about the digital with the human touch, which is to share and collaborate after you've done some analytics. And in the B2B space, of course, everything needs to be cyber-secured end-to-end. What we face today, though, when I say it has been globalized, and it was hinted a bit in the morning already, but we see this a lot with our global customers. However, we see a fragmentation of this planet. There is geopolitically driven ecosystems that are emerging. You have the Chinese ecosystem, you have the Russia ecosystem, you have the European ecosystem, which has a very different sensibility on data than, for example, the United States ecosystem. And within the US, you have California again as another ecosystem. Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, more going into the direction of the European way. So in terms of going from the macro level, the internet has changed this topic, how to create ecosystems and how fast to build them. On the micro level, companies need to establish how this digital value chain looks like. If I go to the very micro level, and here comes my third point, what has become more and more important, we believe, is purpose. It's not only digital, it's the human touch. And here, we believe culture plays a vital role. And here, for us, being embedded in an ecosystem that is moving thanks to technology very fast, we put a lot of emphasis, and it's one of our guiding principles, on co-innovation with customers. We need to learn faster. And that's why we changed also our claim. Ecosystems have been there, but I think they are much more powerful nowadays thanks to the globalization, thanks to the digital. Yet, in an ecosystem, it will be only persistent if it has the right purpose and the balance of purpose within the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Helmut. So just really quickly before we move on, I want to pick up on Orange's evolution as an ecosystem player. I'm curious, what do you think made its ecosystem so attractive that after it was bought by France Telecom, the entire company rebranded to adopt the Orange name?
Yeah,
that says something about
discussing before with Senor Rafael here on the side. Actually, it was a reverse takeover in terms of brand. Mm-hmm. And why? Because France Telecom was a fantastic brand, a traditional brand, but the name itself already indicates it's limited a bit to the hexagon, as we would say in France. Mm. Whereas Orange had this notion of being cool, being innovative. And let's not forget, Orange is a player on the consumer internet side, specifically a European player and an African player. And there's a lot of innovation happening in Africa where I think we are still underestimating the power of this continent in terms of innovation that is coming there. If just one aspect in Orange Money nowadays, we have more than 40 million customers. We can discuss this later on. But the reason was really to embed and to more reflect a perspective. And perspective in terms of strategy, I believe, is very important.
Mm-hmm. To capture the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So now we have Yoshikune, who will talk to us about the importance of trust when creating and managing digital ecosystems. And he's going to give us a look at how Fujitsu does it.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to be with you all. Could you show my slides? OK, anyway. Fujitsu is a Japan-based global
They're
IT
good
company
slides.
with about $37 billion of revenue. And our 130,000 people are working with our customers around the world. OK, but today, ecosystems have become big on the business agenda. In a global survey of 900 business leaders in 9 countries this year, we found that 66% of organizations had already embraced ecosystem in some way. But today, I want to talk about trust in the digital ecosystem era. Trust is very important. Why? Digital technology is driving a massively connected, autonomous, and distributed world. As Helmut already said, everything is being connected. There are already 4 billion people, as well as nearly 40 billion things connected to on the internet. And moreover, artificial intelligence is advancing very rapidly, enabling more autonomous decisions and operations. So soon, maybe Nicole, your cars will start to communicate with other cars and drive autonomously. And all these are changing the way we do businesses. The borders of existing industries are fast fading away. OK. Yes. Now come. Diverse values for individual customer needs are being co-created in distributed ecosystems, such as mobility experience, personalized financing, or personalized healthcare, and more. That's good. So digital has brought a lot of benefits for us. But do you feel something's wrong? In return, we are experiencing a chaotic world, and chaos is growing in many areas. So, can you trust data? And are you willing to provide your private data to external organizations? In our global survey, 72% of business leaders expressed they are worried organizations are exploiting their private data without their permissions. I feel the same. Also, can you trust the judgment of AI? At its core, AI is just a data learning machine. So its decisions may reflect the distortion and biases of the data. And also, complexity is increasing. We are facing many serious global challenges, such as sustainability of our cities, or global warming, aging of our population, and more. We cannot continue to take a position that these are not our business responsibilities. Indeed, these are systemic, complex challenges involving many different stakeholders. So we need to take an ecosystem approach to solve them. So all these challenges around the data, AI, and societal complexity are issues of trust. Now we need to rebuild trust. So how can you build trusted ecosystem together with your customers and partners? So what is necessary? I think there are 3 keys. So first, he already mentioned, deeply think about where your business fits in greater society and design the purpose-driven business. In a global survey, over 70% of business leaders say they can trust organizations that have clear visions, and it is very important to align business and societal goals. And to my surprise, 66% of them already incorporated the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, into their corporate strategies. And second, again, maybe I repeat you, be human-centric. So Fujitsu has been emphasizing our human-centric vision for many years, probably longer than anybody else. It simply means putting people at the center of everything. So how can you empower people to innovate? And how can you co-create new values together with your customers and partners? That's important. And third, I want to tell you, think about create trust using technology. In this massively connected, autonomous, and distributed world, no institution, either government or a company, can assure real-time transactions between too many people and too many intelligent things. Technology must be embedded in every physical and digital process of this highly distributed digital ecosystem. We call this digital trust. So for example, Fujitsu was delivering trusted technologies such as explainable AI, which people can use AI with confidence, or the quantum-inspired computing to solve really complex societal challenges, such as urban traffic, and blockchain solutions to allow ecosystem partners to exchange everything securely and in a trusted way. Good, time is up. So purpose-driven, human-centric digital trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoshikune. I do want to ask before we move on, if you could just give us some, you mentioned blockchain, but can you give us some examples of ecosystems that Fujitsu is actively working to develop right now?
Okay, maybe I can give you the blockchain-based a new type of distributed ecosystem. But that's regarding the, how do I say, reinventing very legacy business. That's rice trading. There's a huge market of rice trading, but that's really a complex, traditional, play involving many different types of players, including the sellers and the buyers and the shippers, inspectors, and the insurers, or the payment system orders, or regulators. Really complex. So we partnered with a new rice exchange based in Switzerland, and enabling the world first global blockchain-based rice trading digital platform. Okay, so blockchain is really good, allowing every ecosystem player to share exactly same accurate and trusted transaction data in real time. So it's still at the infant stage, but we had already gained 600 early adopters from 60 countries, I believe. So let's see.
Thank you. Last, but certainly not least, Valerie is going to talk about how Austro Control, which, if you don't know, it controls air traffic and safety in the Austrian airspace, how they think about ecosystems and what is needed to make them work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll start off because probably most of you don't know Austro Control, what we do and what we are. Basically, our product is safety in aviation. In more concrete, we have two business units. One is Austria's aviation authority, meaning that if you want to become a pilot, you would come to us and get your license, hopefully, or airlines get their air operator certificate, drone users get their drone licenses. On the other part, we are Austria's air navigation service provider. What does that mean? Basically, we control and manage the whole airspace over Austria. That means we are critical and crucial for pilots and passengers that they can travel safely. Now, I believe compared to the two other practitioners on the panel here, the company that I represent is a bit different by nature. How come? First of all, we're 100% state-owned. Secondly, 25 years ago, we were part of the Federal Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure. That means that we carry some heritage with us, which is an asset, but can be a burden on the other hand. Thirdly, we are a monopolist. We are entitled by state law to do our job. And therefore, we are responsible for a sovereign task. So that makes us a bit different to panelists before me. And finally, we're a safety organization, which means that we're not able to be very free and agile in the way we process our things. We have structures, we have hierarchies, we work in command and control. We have clear rules and procedures which are very necessary when it comes to air traffic controllers who need to do their job and take decisions every hour, every minute. Now, having said that and pointed out to the differences, still, I would say that Austro Control not only has to ask itself what ecosystems means to us, but actually, I would postulate that the airspace as such is an ecosystem. So actually, we are operating in an ecosystem that is even global. Why is that? Of course, there are many users in the airspace, there are many stakeholders, and we are all highly dependent on each other. Therefore, collaboration has always been a key in reaching our goals. And I think now what has changed now in recent times is that technology has driven questions or has posed questions that need to be answered and that enable us to think differently of how we can solve problems in the future. Also, a second trend that we see, of course, is the phenomenon of drones. These are, let's say, airspace users that are new to our industry, to my industry, and we have not tackled yet or found an answer how to integrate them safely into the airspace. So there are new trends coming up that make us even more have to think about how we want to deal with this ecosystem of a joint airspace. Maybe you've heard of the political initiative Single European Sky. It's not new, it's on a European level, in order to force the air navigation service providers to work together more closely, and some successes have been already seen. However, I believe we have to cooperate even more together. Now, having outlined a bit the nature or the character of my industry and my company, I would like to pose 5 questions that actually drive us when we think of ecosystems from a business perspective. And they are probably not new, and some have already been mentioned in parts. So let me start with number 1. I think I'm the best, or my company is the best example for the hypothesis that ecosystems are not a phenomenon of digital industries anymore. So ecosystems actually are playing an increasing important role for established companies, for production-oriented industries, for asset-heavy industries. So it's nothing that can only be seen as a new phenomenon from digital companies like we know them from the Silicon Valley. Second, I think very important, I believe when you let others into your value chain, you have to think what is your USP ultimately. And I believe that if you give up on certain assets, on certain USPs, then I believe what is really crucial to think about is what is the value of your customer relationship. And I believe that actually the customer relationship is the most important asset in an ecosystem from a single business point of view. So when we think of ecosystems, I always ask the question, what does it mean for our relationship with our users, with our customers? I think that's something that is important in strategy processes and discussions as well. Thirdly, and I think it was already discussed this morning, it's a low-brainer, but still it's important, standards of interoperability are key. They are really an enabler, and we can talk about ecosystems if we don't get to manage a certain set of standards that everybody can agree upon. It will only be a theoretical discussion that we're having. So standards of interoperability is fundamental. 4, I think personally very interesting, is that when you let others in, those might be competitors. So that means competitors can become allies. I think that's sort of a game changer because it means that your employees cannot be told that the others are enemies and we have to be better than the others, but we actually have to cooperate together and we have to be trustful and trustworthy with each other. So that's something that really needs to be considered. It's possible that on a certain step of the value chain you cooperate, and on other steps of the value chain you still are competitors. And the last point is, it's obvious as well, but it's so important, people and talent, of course, are key in tackling the hurdles and challenges with ecosystems. Even more, I believe, for 3 reasons, because you need different skill sets. Finally, you need, technicians, you need more law expertise in your teams, so it's opening up. Secondly, speed and adaptability are critical capacities that you need in your teams. And finally, the social skill set, I believe, becomes ever more important these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie. But just to quickly pick up on the talent aspect yet, which we haven't talked about a ton. So, you mentioned adaptability is a core skill that companies need if they want to create and manage, like very dynamic ecosystems. What would you recommend to organizations for how they can attain that adaptive talent?
Well, I think, as always, it's important to first look at the starting point. Where do you come from? Are you a startup company that knows adaptability best already, or are you an old company where you actually have to bring in new resources with new mindsets and skill sets? If it's the last, I think what could be a very easy answer to your question is to look at the IT sector and the modern IT sector, because there the people, the employees have learned to adapt rapidly to new environments, to new circumstances, to new user demands. And I think that could be a source to bring in new mindsets into a company.
So model the IT approach. That's great. So thank you all. Now I just want to have a discussion with all of you. And I want to start on a slightly more personal note by asking about how ecosystems have changed your jobs. You're all in strategy roles in one form or another, whether you study it or are responsible for leading it at a company. So I'm curious, how has the rise of ecosystems changed what you do? Martin, maybe you can start.
I think for us, in two ways. It's a topic of research. It's the next generation of consulting offerings, and there's plenty to study. What are the fixed components of ecosystems? How do you design an ecosystem? How do you regulate for an ecosystem? It's a whole new research agenda. And I think as a business, it's always a good discipline to take any idea you're thinking about and apply it to your own business. I think for us, we are a typical business in the sense that we are moving from a fairly closed, isolated model to an open model. So, perhaps 10 years ago, our business was bringing an integrated offering to clients. Increasingly, it's tapping into talent and knowledge wherever that may come from to create an integrated offering for clients.
Great. Rafael, what do you think?
Yeah, Oxford University is an ecosystem, though what we decide to do in the business school is not necessarily aligned with what the School of Government or the School of Medicine does. But we collaborate with each other quite a lot. So I've done work on the future of illegal wildlife trade, the future of nanotech, the future of diseases, with various colleagues across that. I think one of the things that, to me, is loud and clear, I was interested when I heard from Helmut that in Orange you're using a digital value chain. To me, it doesn't resonate, because in the value chain, at least the way Michael Porter wrote it, every actor has only one role. You're either a supplier or a producer or a customer. And we heard from Valerie that in the ecosystem world, competitors can be allies in one team, partners in the next one, customers in the next one, investors in the next one. So we work in a world where each of us has multiple roles, depending which end of the offering you're in. And I'm a professor of practice at Oxford, which means that I not only have to be a good academic, I also have to be practical. And I'm allowed several weeks a year to do consulting. So sometimes I'm a consultant, sometimes a researcher, sometimes a teacher. And you have to be clear that on a clinical basis, all three roles can work together, but that there are conflicts between the roles.
Of course.
And so you have to be going back to the trust issue, you have to be pretty clear, cards on the table. At what point are you engaging with somebody as the teacher?
Yeah.
At what point as a researcher?
Which
and at
role
what
you're
point
in.
as a consultant?
That's great. Thank you. Helmut, what do you think?
Yeah, to come back on this digital value chain, sometimes you're indeed, the roles might be very different. Even in our case, you need to be very clear about, I think this was Valerie said, about the core proposition, because you need to be and stay relevant. We strongly believe that's the impact on myself, if I come back to your question, that I spend an awful lot of time on exploring together with the team on what are the right partnerships that we are seeing, and they might be sometimes driven primarily from, not sometimes, primarily they are driven from the customer demand and from what we see as a pattern. So for us, when we co-built our strategy, it's very much also having the right antennas across the globe. You know, it's important to see what our Chinese teams is feeding back, what our Indian team is feeding back, what our US teams are feeding back, to grasp what is a pattern, and then also to be agile enough to foster those partnerships, and then to also convince the team, and that's the culture aspect, because we are, you know, we're also proud engineers, that not everything has to be done by ourselves. Maybe there's a value in terms of speed, in terms of proposition to our customers, if we do this in partnership with another ecosystem player.
Great, thank you. Yoshikune?
Good. I worked for Fujitsu 35 years.
35 years.
Can you imagine that? Such a long time. But I was mostly engaged in the international business, traveling a lot of countries and negotiating. The negotiation was with a one-on-one relationship. So a joint venture with Alcatel or strategic alliance with Cisco, of that kind of business was my life. But 6 years ago, probably ecosystem changed my life. So we launched our vision, that our human-centric vision to co-create human-centric value together with customers. So it was a journey. So it took time for us, for our people to understand such kind of new idea. We are still struggling, but our journey continues. So this year, under the leadership of our new president, Tokita, we are accelerating our transformation into a new generation organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Valerie?
I think it has changed in a way that a high degree of ambiguity has entered into my personal work environment, and I think into companies in general. It's not often clear at first sight whether a new opportunity really is an opportunity or whether it could also turn out to become a threat. So you have to change, I believe, the way you look at things and you analyze things. So you have to probably think broader in a way. You have to also change the thinking, and I think if I break it down to a work day, it's just more communication, because you have to get in touch not only with the company but also with partners outside even more. So that's probably more communication.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm curious about how most of the examples that you hear about, they're native ecosystems. You know, so aside from Austro Control, which you told us a lot about, when we think about ecosystems, I tend to think about, you know, digital platforms. I think about Google, Alibaba, Tencent, Amazon, and you know, I've always wondered if traditional incumbent companies that sell products, if they can successfully transform to become an ecosystem. Obviously, they can, as you spoke about, but isn't it hard? Does anyone have thoughts on that, Martin?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we can name some examples of companies that have made a product-centric to ecosystem switch. In some ways, Apple is one of them, for example, but not so many. So why? I think it's for two reasons. One of them is that while ecosystems, collaborative, dynamic systems are an old idea, technology really potentiates the extent to which we can manage huge amounts of complexity using information technology. So, you know, having the technology is one thing. I think the second one, though, is the habits of what I call mechanical thinking. So I think traditionally management is based upon a notion of knowing everything we need to know, controlling everything we need to control, and being able to plan everything which subsequently happens. The moment you put a lot of entities together into a dynamic arrangement, you start to get emergence and unpredictability. So as opposed to mechanical thinking, you need what I call more biological thinking, thinking that embraces uncertainty, serendipity, emergence. And that biological way of thinking is a very different way of thinking. It's even manifest in the questions that we ask. For example, we may ask the question, how do you design an ecosystem? Well, we've heard, it's a little bit of a paradox to say that you can create a permanent design for an ecosystem. Yeah. So it even goes back to the questions which manifest how we think about these things.
Very true.
Yeah, I spend most of my time these days doing scenario planning. There's a speaker somewhere in the conference who is a futurist. I'm not a futurist, I'm a scenario planner. And the reason for that is that because of all of the change, turbulence, complexity, speed that people have related to to design something from a potential future to the present is much more helpful than from the present to the future. I've done work on the future of patenting, the future of chemistry with the Royal Society of Chemistry, the whole chemical sciences field, the future of diabetes, which in the UK is the single biggest disease spend of the National Health Service and going up as a percentage. And when you look at these complex systems, whether it's the chemical sciences, patenting, or a disease like diabetes, or I've worked on the future of financial stability with the IMF, and you bring those futures to come. I think, Martin, you're the only native English speaker in the panel. My native language is Spanish, and I look with great respect at the words in English. In English, the word the future is not something you go into, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. It's something that comes at you and that you expect to be different from you. So if a future is coming towards us, a more digital future, a more globalized or less globalized future, depending on what happens in the White House, and so on and so forth, and you look at those futures coming towards you, then you have to design for a value-creating system and an offering that is going to live in those multiple futures.
Yep.
And we bring the design from the future to the present. So we run a one-week program, and we have people from all kinds of walks of life, the future of a religion in one case, the future of a disease, the future of a field, coming to us. And when you have that kind of richness, then bringing it down to companies is relatively straightforward.
Interesting.
Relatively.
Thank you. Helmut, I saw you raise your hand.
I think that, a good vision attracts talent. Culture makes them to stay. And on this cultural aspect, I believe what we can contribute is that we create this notion of curiosity. And that's why we also don't say innovation is important for our teams. We say it's co-innovation. We are ahead in our industry of major launches on 5G. We just have launched this in Romania, for example. And the B2B space will be an area of real innovation thanks to the 5G. Now, do we know already today what is there in 2 years thanks to these new capabilities? No. We have some ideas, and we said the best thing is to go out, in this case, to work either with technology ecosystem partner, but directly with our customers to define what's there. So it needs this notion of the co in the wording of what we are doing, and this creates the openness and the curiosity. What helps there in some of the new areas that we have entered into, I mentioned analytics business, I mentioned the cloud business, if you can do some acquisitions in this space, because then you have critical size, and this gives also a strong voice internally and the appetite to learn from them. And they come, by the way, with this. We bought a Norwegian cloud-based company across 5 countries in Europe, and an analytics company in 11 countries. They come with their own ecosystems and enrich what you're doing. And is it hard? Yes, it's hard.
So, I mean, Valerie, you brought up Austro Control, and you had told me yesterday that 25 years ago it was still part of the federal ministry. Do these perspectives on transformation, the difficulty or the straightforwardness, do they resonate with you and the experience that you've seen or learned about at Austro Control?
Yeah, so Austro Control and also ÖBB, the Austrian Railways, where I worked previously, they are both were designed to work and act as a company with solid boundaries, let's say. So it's of course, it's a transformation process that you need to undergo. And the question is how can you best manage to do that? For the railways, it was an easy case because competition came in, so they lost the monopoly in certain business units. So then obviously every employee, every staff understood that something had to change and new solutions were necessary. With Austro Control, of course, it's a bit different. There are, as I said, some political and heavy and serious discussions, of course, going on in jointly combining those over 40 navigation service providers within Europe to consolidate the very fragmented landscape here. But still, I think you need to show the case for each employee in order to make them feel the drive and the necessity to adapt that new circumstances arrive, since ecosystems usually provide new solutions that can hopefully be better than old ones.
So since we're talking about challenges, I do, for the people in this audience who are building business ecosystems or innovation ecosystems, would like to give them a sense of what challenges they should be expecting to confront. And Yoshikune, I'm wondering if you can tell us a story or give us an example to illustrate some of the main challenges that you and your team have faced in managing the ecosystem at Fujitsu.
Right. So my team launched the Fujitsu's new, technology vision 6 years ago. It was understood. It took time, but it was understood by people and also our customers, and also resonated probably. I hope. But difficult part. It was difficult for them to take action. It was really difficult to change the behavior. So why? Probably the mindset problem and also strategic alignment. So the ecosystems are quite difficult to understand probably for the people who are just supplying computers or providing IT services to customers. Ecosystem play is difficult to understand. So we have to open up. So now we are transforming the mindset of people by infusing more the importance of inclusion and diversity and innovative culture, allowing more failures, that kind of thing. And regarding a strategic alignment, so on one hand, we talked about the vision and strategy, but on the other hand, operations were still governed by existing metrics like short-term profits. So investment naturally flowed into existing lines of business. Okay, that's a difficult challenge, but anyway, we're also transforming that, aligning vision or purpose, strategy, and operations. That's really important, I think.
Thank you. Martin, you want to say something?
I think that the biggest challenge is, I always say that you can't stretch a strategy until you stretch your mind. It's the mental habits of non-ecosystem strategy that's the biggest challenge. And so this morning, Mr. Vargas referred to a paper that we wrote on myths, and there's a bunch of sort of sensible ideas for a product-based business which turn out not to be sensible for an ecosystem strategy, but you have to address those, otherwise you can't really make any progress.
What's an example?
An ecosystem can be designed, an ecosystem can be managed. If we're a big, powerful company, we can be the orchestrator of our own ecosystem. An ecosystem is an end in itself. An ecosystem is a panacea, and you have to address all of these sorts of issues. Another one is that you can have an ecosystem on the outside of a company, some sort of digital marketplace, and a hierarchy inside the company. I mean, I think the gentleman from Tencent spoke about that a little bit this morning. I mean, you need the dynamism inside the company too. So I think sort of being very precise about the words one uses and embracing what I call biological or dynamic systems thinking is essential right at the very beginning of the process, and that's the biggest challenge, I think.
Great. Helmut?
I would say that what is critical is the rational piece, the what can be explained very quickly, and we think always if the what is clear, then the how is almost following automatically. And that's not the case, particularly not in an ecosystem, because it's not only yourself, it's also your ecosystem partner. So it already makes two partners, maybe more, that you need to convince. I think we need to be strongly invested into the human part of building those ecosystems in order to have the how really come to life. And that depends very much on which players you're working with. When you're working with a startup, you might have to, and in the industrial internet space, which is a true ecosystem play where you connect to industrial platforms, you do the connectivity, building some services around, but you have to sometimes also ask the startup for patience. Because it needs the whole chain that needs to be involved and well understood. So how to ensure this is really by starting with very concrete customer cases. That's why co-innovation with customers for us is at the heart. And internally, in our fast-moving technology and data-driven industry, a topic is that we work with partners who are sometimes in co-opetition mode. In case A, we are competitors. In case B, we are working together because we have said it's good to work with them in the ecosystem play. And sometimes people get emotional because they feel, oops, on this case we had a competitive situation. There, we are asked to keep the big picture still in place, to make sure that, yes, in the long run, it makes absolutely sense to work with these partners.
So that tension between competition versus cooperation. So I have like 10 more questions, but I'm going to ask one more before opening up to all of you. So if you have questions, start thinking of them. You can raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll keep asking. But this has come up a couple of times. Platforms are now being very criticized for their scale. There are a lot of concerns that they've become these big monopolies that need to be broken up. And we've talked about, do we need to regulate ecosystems? Is that something that we need to do in order to preserve and build trust with customers? Does this matter more now because of the geopolitically driven ecosystems that Helmut was talking about? I'm just curious what you all think strategists should be thinking about regulation and ecosystems.
So I'm doing some work on the future of regulation with the Lloyd's Register Foundation. And some of the ecosystems that were successful ecosystems were forced by regulators to become companies. Visa and Airbus are sort of two examples of that. And one of the questions is, what is antitrust? Going back to the trust issue that Yoshi brought up in an era of ecosystems. If you look at the big picture, there's more people employed in the world in co-ops than in companies. Many of these co-ops, they're not big Chinese or American companies we talk about in business schools all of the time. And they have operated very well as small, localized, co-productive, quote-unquote, ecosystems within their own setting. So the problem is not the ecosystem. The problem is the size and the political power. The politics of ecosystems is a field that I think has been underexplored, not only by regulators, but by politicians. We see the European stance being quite different from the American stance, being quite different from the Chinese stance, being very different from the Indian stance. So that would be a great PhD dissertation if you want to come to Oxford.
In case anyone is interested. Martin, do you have thoughts, or Helmut?
Yeah, well, the regulation we have is not fit for purpose, I think, for ecosystems. I mean, it's mainly based on a concept of consumer harm in many countries. And, if the consumers are getting goods more quickly with a greater variety at lower prices, it's hard to argue that there's a current future harm. One can argue that there's a potential future harm if concentration gets too high. The other issue, particularly for Europe, which is, I think, fair to say, it's fairly obvious it's falling behind technologically relative to the US and China, is that not all ecosystems, but the largest and most powerful ecosystems are global, and looking at things on a traditional regulatory country-by-country market share or regional market share basis will not breed global champion enterprises, which you could argue may be necessary for the competitiveness of the region. So both in industrial policy and regulation, I think we need an entire rethink of the framework. And the problem is, of course, that the rate of innovation in business is 100 times faster than the rate of innovation in regulation. So there's a mismatch there.
Yeah. Helmut?
Yeah, in terms of this question, should they be broken up or not broken up? Platforms call for scale. They have the big advantage, and they need investment. If we observe today in the world, all of the big digital platform players were nascent in areas where there's also strong military power. Let's not forget this. Typically, those innovations are spin-offs in this military industrial ecosystem something. Sorry if I say it like this, ecosystem something. So that's one thing you observe. And here, Europe has a role to play, I believe, because I can tell you, in being a big player in cyber defense, having a European passport as a company helps a lot. Working in this more and more fragmented geopolitically data ecosystems in Russia or in China, etc. And I believe what we would say is that at least, and we have big hopes for the new European Commission, to hopefully not only say continue the same concept, which is we have the European common market and we have to create even more competition in Europe, which is fine, but it also has become meanwhile a global play. If you think about this famous industrial side of Alstom and Siemens, etc., it has become a global play and no more an intra-European play, which was the right thing to do in the 90s. And I think we have to get past this one.
Yeah. Valerie, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, so I come from a heavily regulated environment,
Right.
so I should pose, yes, regulation is the answer, but I'm not sure whether this is the case, since regulations always lag behind, of course, actual problems. It might be a solution for protection of end customers, for end consumers. So there it might be a good mean to this problem. Otherwise, I would, from a business perspective, from a microeconomic perspective, I would focus on the governance of an ecosystem more than on the regulatory environment.
Yeah.
So who is in lead of an ecosystem, and why is that the case? And do I want to play within those rules? Can I in some way change the rules? Do I have options? And I think those might be questions that are relevant from a business perspective.
Great, thank you. So we would love to open up the floor to...
Can I say one more thing about
Yes,
regulation?
sure.
I think the digital world is moving from applied physics to applied biology. And we had the Financial Conduct Authority in Oxford, and we asked them, how many biologists under the age of 30 do you have on staff to understand how digital is becoming to life? So I would think regulators should hire biologists, and they should also start looking at the climate change implications of this.
Yeah.
Would it be mandatory to have a climate emergency contingency plan for your company?
It's a great point. Thank you. So I saw one question here. You have a microphone. Go ahead. Hello.
Actually, following up on what you just said, Rafael, I think there's a question around who will be making strategy in the future? Increasing complexity, uncertainty. Doesn't it require all of us to rethink the idea of the lone strategist that writes a beautiful paper that a board then, votes on, and it becomes the thing that we do for the next 5 years? So in an ecosystem, what are the ways and the tools that we have at our hand to really truly understand how to build a strategic framework that can support in such an uncertain future?
Thank you. Great question.
There's a book by my colleague Richard Whittington called Opening Strategy that just came out in Oxford University Press. And his view about 60 years of strategy is that strategy is opening up, not because people decide to do it, but because there's requirements from society to make it much more open. That means you're going to have much more courageous conversations as a strategist going forward. I just posted in the last Friday a piece on Knowledge at Wharton about why corporate strategy is losing the plot on climate change. It's investor relations that is setting that up. It's lawyers setting it up. It's risk management setting it up for the board. And what to do with it. Very good. But it's going to be a much more open conversation.
Yeah. I saw 3 hands here, so maybe we can go quickly. Martin?
Right. If I may make a small plug for my book, it's precisely about the fact that strategy is still not restricted to planning. Planning is still relevant in some situations, but we need planning, adaptation, visioning, shaping, and renewal. And the thing about ecosystems is that they, especially digital ecosystems, they tend to evolve very fast. So actually, we need not only a different type of strategy, we probably need a succession of different types of strategy. The imagination of the entrepreneur moving to the adaptive properties of an ecosystem, perhaps temporarily to a more sort of classical plan mode, and with co-opetition shaping strategy too. So we need to generalize the concept of strategy, I think, beyond the solitary top-down episodic planning exercises that we may imagine by the word.
Great. Helmut?
I think in this ecosystem world, I would not believe really into this ivory tower kind of strategist thinking. It needs to be connected with the context, and it requires a solid understanding of the context. The inputs for building this can come from all parts of the ecosystem, from internal, from outside, from the business. And I think what we are observing at least, it's, maybe the end point where you want to go to in 2 or 3 years, but in between you have to be very adaptive.
Yoshikune?
One very important thing about ecosystem play is that the ecosystem will change customers to partners. So strategy making process will definitely need to involve customers. How can we not co-create business, but co-create strategy? Probably we need to use the design thinking and so on into strategy making process.
Thank you for your question. I think I saw some hands over here. Does anyone else have a question? I don't know where the mic is.
Hi.
Oh, hello.
Hi, my name is Leslie Antu, and I have so many questions, and it's a very interesting panel. Thank you. Thank you all for participating. My question is based on something that Helmut said earlier. You mentioned that in an ecosystem environment, the what and the how they're changing. The what is somewhat clear, but the how becomes very, very complex. When I work with clients, I always talk about 3 parts to strategy and strategy development, and certainly to planning: the what, the why, and the how. And for me, the why is what drives people. What are your thoughts on that purpose, that vision, the why, in the context of ecosystem strategy development?
I think that the why is an extremely important compass. Do you say compass in English? A compass for your teams. Again, I said somewhere before that people join because of your vision, and I think it's also because of your compass. And we should not underestimate how important this vitalizing energy is that comes from purpose. We are just doing an internal exercise at the whole Orange Group. Our chairman has launched this to redefine the purpose for the next coming years. We had more than 130,000 inputs on our internal social media use. So we should not underestimate how much people are actually attached and also ready and share. And the question of purpose, I think, has gone up extremely over the past 4 or 5 years. Huh?
Thank you.
I agree.
Valerie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can just reinforce your statement. It's the intrinsic motivation that is addressed by the why, by the employees. And I think that's why communication becomes even more important with ecosystems, because you need to explain to your colleagues, to your employees, why we are doing it, but maybe something that is not clear in the at first sight, but something that needs to be explained because, for example, you want to collaborate with a competitor more closely, and then it's like, why are we doing this? And then the why is in question. So you really need to permanently, I think, communicate with the company.
Great, thank you. I want to try to squeeze in a few more questions. So who has the mic now? Hello.
Hi. I have a question to Martin. You said ecosystems can be managed. How can one look into this type of management? Is it the power of the most powerful player in the ecosystem, but the others are not to be treated like employees? So how exactly is this management structure to be looked at?
Yeah, I was actually rather trying to emphasize the opposite, which is ecosystems cannot be managed as much as we may think or desire. But an interesting example of that is I had the pleasure of helping Alibaba to codify some of their practices, because as we said, a lot of the innovations are occurring in practice, not in theory. So there's a codification challenge. Why are the things that some companies doing, like Alibaba, are actually working? And so in a conversation with Alibaba about trying to codify their principles, we had a discussion about one of their principles, which was, at the time, it literally translated as never let an MBA near a marketplace. And I thought it was a translation mistake, but it turns out that was the statement. But the idea is quite profound. The idea is that managers are trained to manage, but if we adopt a market-based evolutionary mechanism, essentially we undermine the value of that adaptive process if we try to manage it. So therefore, in some sense, the challenge is to subtract management from where it doesn't belong in the evolutionary systems of marketplaces. And the interesting thing, that applies not only externally, but internally. So it may be sort of a subtraction of irrelevant management, maybe as much as asking the question, as important as asking the question, what new types of management do we need?
Thank you. Take another question. There's one here, there's one over there. Let's get you two. You can go ahead.
Okay. My question is for you, Yoshikune. You said before that it was difficult or is difficult to change people's behavior. So the question is, what kind of behavior do you expect from people that work in an ecosystem, and especially from leaders? And now, given the last statements from you, Martin, I think it's you can co-create on the answer.
Thank you.
Yes, a certain behavior is that to open up. So. In many cases, in the existing businesses, people's mindset is pretty much closed. It tends to rely on internal resources and simple procedures and supply or deliver something to customers. That's kind of mindset. But we need to change that to open up, to collaborate with others, or explore something new, different ways. But it's really complex to collaborate with many ecosystem partners. Is really difficult. So now we're encouraging the people to test new ideas, but design new ideas using design thinking and so on. So collaboration is very important. How we can make people more collaborate with others. That is, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more quick question. I see a hand here. If someone can give him a microphone.
Thank you. Chris Frando, L'Oreal USA Organization Development. And I wanted to build on the biological perspective. And the late Russian naturalist, Peter Kropotkin, traveled 50,000 miles, spent 10 years studying ecosystems in Siberia. And in his 1902 essay, Mutual Aid, he noted that ecosystems and species survive and thrive when there is a lack of competition and an abundance of cooperation, and suggested that human society could learn a lot from nature and cooperation. So my question is, what is the greatest threat to ecosystem vitality, and are there limits to mutual cooperation and ecosystem responsibility?
Okay.
Thank you. Quickly, yeah.
I certainly teach that in the turbulent times we're in, collaborative strategy trumps competitive strategy. If you're a football fan, Paris Saint-Germain will go and play Aston Villa in a stadium. They don't shoot each other. They collaborate to make football a viable business and then compete within it. And that collaboration is absolutely essential strategically in ecosystem networked worlds.
Great. Martin, really quickly?
Yeah, I mean, my view would be that collaboration competition is too simplistic a distinction to capture the essence of the biological thinking that we need for ecosystems. And so I think it's about maintaining adaptability. There's a paradox that when we've found a successful model, we tend to stick to it. But this sort of assumes that the world doesn't change. So we did some work with Princeton University on the characteristics of resilient, evolvable systems, and came up with 6 principles, which I'd briefly name: redundancy, diversity, modularity, evolvability, prudence, and embeddedness in the broader nested systems of society and the natural ecology and so on. So, there are other formulations, but I think that's, whatever formulation you adopt, that's a very different way of thinking from the I analyze the causal relationships, I have a plan, the plan is working or not, and the plan persists sort of mechanical thinking. So I endorse the assumption of your question in a way that we need a different way of thinking about these things.
Thank you. Okay, we are out of time, and I'll get in trouble if I keep you here any much longer. I know there's a lot more to say, but we'll be around the conference, so please feel free to come ask them questions. But for now, please join me in thanking our amazing panelists.
Thank you.